It was a cold evening in 1887 when the knock came. The wind howled through the Wyoming plains, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only the dark silhouettes of the homestead against the vast, empty wilderness. Inside the small house, Catherine Albright sat by the flickering fire, her face shadowed by the grief she had lived with for 6 long months. The warmth from the flames couldn't melt the chill that had settled deep inside her. The loss of her husband, Thomas, had left her broken. 6 months ago, she had found his lifeless body in the field, a victim of a farming accident. The moment was seared into her memory, his lifeless eyes, the coldness of his hands. She had never felt so utterly alone. It wasn't just the loss of her husband that had changed her. It was the way grief twisted her heart into something unrecognizable. She had tried to hold on, to keep his memory alive, but it became too painful. She burned his clothes, threw out the photos, and vowed never to let anyone close again. Never again, she would whisper to herself, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on her. The townspeople had begun to whisper too, calling her mad, saying she was losing her mind. Catherine didn't care. She didn't care about anything anymore. The house had fallen into disrepair. The roof leaked, the barn door was hanging off its hinges, and the well pump was broken. Catherine didn't have the strength, the will, or the resources to fix anything. There were days when she could barely bring herself to get out of bed. The harsh Wyoming winters were biting, and her firewood was running low, but it was all she could do to keep herself warm. She had no family left. Her father had passed years ago, and Thomas's family had abandoned her after his death. It was just her now, alone in the house they had built together. That evening, as she sat in the dim light of the fire, Catherine heard it, an unmistakable knock on the door. She froze, her hand instinctively going to the rifle propped against the wall. It was not a sound she had expected. No one ever came to her door anymore, not since Thomas had died. The idea of someone needing something from her filled her with dread. It felt like an intrusion, like the world had decided it wasn't done taking from her. The knock came again, more persistent this time, and her heart began to race. She couldn't ignore it. Not this time. She stood up slowly, the weight of the rifle heavy in her hands. Her mind raced. Who could it be? A lost traveler? A beggar? Or worse, someone with bad intentions? She crept toward the window, peeking through the dusty curtains. The first thing she saw was a man, tall and weathered, with a young girl clinging to his side. The girl was shivering, wrapped in a tattered shawl, her face pale with the cold. Catherine's heart lurched at the sight. But there was something else in the man's eyes, desperation. She saw it clearly, and it made her feel uneasy. Taking a deep breath, Catherine opened the door. She stepped onto the porch, rifle still in hand, her eyes hard and unyielding. The man looked at her with a mix of caution and hope in his eyes. His voice was rough, hoarse from the cold. "It's cold, ma'am. Can we sleep in your barn? Just tonight. I can work for it." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken desperation. Catherine's eyes flicked to the girl. She was trembling violently, her small frame barely able to hold itself upright. The cough that racked her body sent a chill down Catherine's spine. The child was sick. Catherine felt an unfamiliar pang in her chest. Her lips pressed together in a tight line as she fought to suppress the emotions that threatened to surface. The man's face was lined with exhaustion, and his words were barely more than a whisper, as if the very act of asking for help was a burden he could barely bear. "I swear I'll work for it. Just let her sleep somewhere warm." Catherine felt the weight of the rifle in her hands, the cold metal a stark reminder of a life she had been living, detached, isolated, unwilling to let anyone in. Her mind screamed at her to turn them away. She had no room for anyone else in her life, no space for more pain, more loss. She had made that vow to herself when Thomas died. No one would ever get close to her again. And yet, as she looked at the girl, something inside her shifted. She saw herself in the child, The vulnerability, the fragility. She remembered her own fear when she had been left alone, when there had been no one to turn to. The weight of it was unbearable, and she knew, deep down, that she couldn't let them freeze out here. Not like this. The silence between them stretched on, a heavy, suffocating pause. Isaac, the man, waited, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked at Catherine, as if willing her to understand. Her eyes locked onto his for a moment, and in that brief instant, something unspoken passed between them. He was not just asking for a place to sleep. He was asking for a chance for his daughter to survive, for them both to have hope again. Her lips parted, and for a brief moment, Catherine forgot the rifle in her hand, the wall she had built around herself, and the vow she had made. What she did next would change everything. "Not the barn," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and for a fleeting second, she almost regretted the words. Isaac stood frozen, as if he didn't understand. He had come here expecting nothing more than a place in the barn, but her answer was different. "The barn is no place for a child. Come inside," she said more firmly this time. Isaac's face softened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Catherine cut him off, her tone resolute. "Don't make me say it again." And with that, the door creaked open, and the two of them stepped into her home, into the silence that had ruled her life for far too long. She busied herself with the fire, with the water, with the blankets, not meeting their eyes. She wouldn't let herself get too close. Not yet. She couldn't. But as the warmth from the fire spread through the room, Catherine knew that, for better or worse, she had opened a door she couldn't close again. And Isaac, for the first time in days, felt the smallest glimmer of hope. Catherine's tears welled up as she lowered the rifle, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the decision sank in. "Not the barn," she whispered, the words soft but resolute. Isaac froze, his mind racing, thinking she was rejecting their plea. But then she spoke again, and this time her words were firmer. "The barn is no place for a child. Come inside." Isaac stood motionless, stunned, unsure if he had heard her correctly, his pride battling with his desperation. He had come expecting nothing more than a spot in the barn, a place where he could protect Ellie from the cold. But her offer was something else entirely, something he had not dared to hope for. "You don't have to do this," Isaac began, his voice filled with uncertainty. But Catherine cut him off with a sharpness that brooked no argument. "Don't," she said, her tone not unkind but firm. "Just warm up." Isaac's throat tightened with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, and they entered her home, cautiously, as though every movement might shatter the fragile truce between them. Catherine busied herself with the fire, water, and blankets, avoiding their eyes, moving in mechanical, deliberate motions as though this act of mercy were something she could detach from, something she could distance herself from emotionally. She wouldn't look at them. She couldn't. Her heart ached with a quiet, painful yearning that she was unwilling to acknowledge. Isaac, for all his exhaustion, could see the hollow emptiness in her eyes, the way she moved as though trying to escape something too painful to face. His gratitude was nearly overwhelming, but he didn't know how to express it, how to make her understand that this kindness, this mercy, meant more to him than he could ever say. The silence between them was thick, almost unbearable, until Ellie, her small voice breaking the quiet, asked, "What's your name?" It was the first time Catherine had spoken in what felt like forever, her name coming out in a soft, almost hesitant whisper, as though it were a word she had not uttered in months. It struck Isaac, that simple request, as a reminder of how much had been lost in the months since Thomas had died, how much Catherine had closed off from the world. The dinner that followed was quiet, awkward. Catherine barely looked at them as she served a simple stew made from the little she had left. Ellie, oblivious to the tension, ate with enthusiasm, while Isaac noticed, with a twinge of sadness, how thin Catherine had become, how fragile she looked under the dim light of the oil lamp. She was surviving, But it was clear to him that she was not truly living. As they ate, Isaac couldn't help but wonder about the life she had led before all this. The woman who had loved her husband, who had dreamed of a future, only to be crushed by loss. Catherine's voice cracked slightly as she mentioned the guest room, the room that had once been intended as a nursery. This was for, she trailed off, her words lost in the weight of the memory. Isaac, sensing her discomfort, finished for her. "A baby?" he asked gently. Catherine nodded stiffly and left the room without another word, leaving Isaac with the growing realization that she was a woman who had been shattered by life, someone who had lost far more than she could bear. That night, after they had settled into their rooms, Isaac could hear the muffled sound of Catherine crying through the thin walls. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her grief, feeling helpless as Ellie slept soundly, warm for the first time in days. Isaac couldn't help but think. She had saved them, but who was going to save her? In the stillness of that night, he made a silent promise to himself. He would stay, not just to protect Ellie, but to protect Catherine too. The morning came too quickly, and Isaac awoke before dawn. He had not slept much, his mind racing with thoughts of how to repay Catherine for her kindness. When he stepped outside, he saw her out by the broken fence, struggling to fix it in the early light. She was trying, but the work was too much for one person, especially someone who had barely the strength to carry on. Without a word, Isaac took the tools from her and began to work, fixing the fence in silence, side by side with her. Catherine looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly, but Isaac only shook his head. "Maybe you could use the help anyway," he said, and they continued working together, wordlessly repairing the small part of her world that had broken. By the time breakfast came, 3 things had been fixed: the fence, the roof, and the well pump, and Isaac couldn't help but smile at the progress. Ellie, meanwhile, was in the kitchen, helping Catherine bake bread, her small hands making a mess, but filling the house with a warmth it hadn't known in a long time. As they sat down for breakfast, Catherine's lips trembled slightly as she caught Isaac's eye, and for the first time in months, she smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a moment of quiet triumph, one that Catherine would later realize marked the beginning of something she hadn't expected, something that would bring more change in her life than she could ever have imagined. But she didn't know that yet. What she didn't know was that outside, in the town of Ash Hollow, the whispers had already started. The townspeople were talking, and trouble was on its way. 1 week later, the homestead no longer felt like a place waiting to die. The days began to shape themselves into a quiet rhythm, rough around the edges but warm in small, unexpected ways. Each morning, Isaac rose before the sun, stepping out into the sharp Wyoming air to tend the animals and check the fences he'd already repaired and the ones that still needed work. Catherine would watch him sometimes from the kitchen window, his figure moving steadily against the pale sky as if he'd always belonged there, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone like him. The roof no longer leaked, the barn door hung straight, and the well pump groaned less and less with each adjustment he made. Inside the house, Ellie became Catherine's shadow. She helped with the laundry, even if she splashed more water than she used, and stood on a small crate beside the stove to stir pots that Catherine carefully watched. In the evenings, after supper, Isaac would sit by the fire and carve little animals out of scraps of wood he found around the property, his large hands gentle and precise. Ellie would sit at his feet, eyes wide with wonder, while Catherine sat at the table with a worn primer, quietly teaching the girl simple words and letters. Sometimes Ellie would mispronounce a word so badly that it sent both adults into quiet laughter, the kind that slipped out before they could stop it. Those moments felt strange to Catherine, like borrowed time from a life she used to dream about, but never believed she'd have. 1 week later, the homestead no longer felt like a place waiting to die. The days began to shape themselves into a quiet rhythm, rough around the edges but warm in small, unexpected ways. Each morning, Isaac rose before the sun, stepping out into the sharp Wyoming air to tend the animals and check the fences he'd already repaired and the ones that still needed work. Catherine would watch him sometimes from the kitchen window, his figure moving steadily against the pale sky, as if he'd always belonged there, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone like him. The roof no longer leaked, the barn door hung straight, and the well pump groaned less and less with each adjustment he made. Inside the house, Ellie became Catherine's shadow. She helped with the laundry, even if she splashed more water than she used, and stood on a small crate beside the stove to stir pots that Catherine carefully watched. In the evenings, after supper, Isaac would sit by the fire and carve little animals out of scraps of wood he found around the property, his large hands gentle and precise. Ellie would sit at his feet, eyes wide with wonder, while Catherine sat at the table with a worn primer, quietly teaching the girl simple words and letters. Sometimes Ellie would mispronounce a word so badly that it sent both adults into quiet laughter, the kind that slipped out before they could stop it. Those moments felt strange to Catherine, like borrowed time from a life she used to dream about but never believed she'd have. She caught herself one afternoon humming while she kneaded bread, the sound so foreign to her own ears that she stopped and pressed her flour-dusted hands flat on the table, heart pounding. I forgot what this felt like, she thought, staring at the light pooling through the small kitchen window. Being alive. But the world outside their fragile little circle had not forgotten her, nor had it grown kinder. When supplies began to run low, Catherine knew she had to go into town. Isaac insisted on coming with her, saying it only made sense since he could help carry things back. But she also knew he didn't want her facing Ash Hollow alone. As they rode in together in the old wagon, Ellie tucked between them. The town rose ahead of them, small and tight-knit, its buildings weathered but proud. Almost immediately, Catherine could feel the eyes on her. People paused mid-conversation, their voices dropping as they watched the widow Albright ride in with a strange man and a child who clearly wasn't hers. Whispers spread like dry grass, catching fire. "Is that the widow?" Someone murmured near the blacksmith shop. "Who's the fellow?" another voice asked. "He's been staying out her place," someone else answered. "Heard there's a little girl too." "You ask me? That ain't proper." In the general store, the air felt colder than the wind outside. The clerk, Mr. Dawkins, barely looked up at first, his expression stiff when he finally did. "Afternoon," Catherine said quietly, setting a list on the counter. His eyes skimmed it, then flicked from her to Isaac with thinly veiled judgment. "Didn't expect to see you in company," he remarked. The words were casual, but the tone wasn't. Near the shelves, the pastor's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, hovered with a basket on her arm, her eyes sharp, but her smile sweet in the way that made Catherine's skin prickle. "Catherine, dear," she said in a syrupy voice, stepping closer. "It's good to see you out and about. People have been talking, you know." Catherine felt Isaac go, still beside her. She met Mrs. Abernathy's gaze evenly. "People always talk," she replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Let them." The pastor's wife blinked, taken aback. She had expected the broken widow, not the woman standing upright with quiet strength in her eyes. As they left the store, carrying flour, coffee, beans, and a few precious extras for Ellie, a couple of men lounged outside the saloon, their eyes tracking Catherine in a way that made Isaac's jaw tighten. Didn't take her long. One of them muttered, loud enough to be heard, "Grieving real fast out on that homestead." Isaac's fists clenched at his sides, and he took a step toward them, anger flashing in his eyes, but Catherine's hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. "Don't," she said quietly. "They're not worth it." On the ride home, the mood was heavy. Ellie leaned sleepily against Catherine, clutching a small wooden whistle Isaac had bought her with one of his last coins. After a long stretch of silence, Isaac cleared his throat. "Catherine," he said, not quite looking at her, If my being here is making things harder for you, if people are turning against you because of us, maybe I should go." The words hit her harder than she expected. Fear flared in her chest, sharp and sudden. "Don't you dare," she said, more sharply than she meant to. He turned, surprised. Her voice softened, but not her resolve. "Don't make that decision for me. I've spent 6 months living in a tomb." Then you knocked on my door, and for the first time, I remembered what it was like to hear laughter in the house, to wake up and not feel the weight of the world crushing my chest. She swallowed hard, her eyes shining. "Don't make me go back to that." Isaac held her gaze, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. "I just don't want to be the reason you lose the town," he said. "I've already lost it," she replied quietly, "long before you came. But here," she glanced at Ellie, then back at him. "Here, I'm starting to feel like I have something again." The wagon creaked on, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full of something unspoken, something fragile and hopeful. 2 weeks after Isaac and Ellie had arrived, their evenings by the fire had begun to feel almost natural. One night, Ellie fell asleep between them on the floor, her head lolling against Catherine's shoulder before sliding onto Isaac's leg. Isaac carefully scooped her up, his arms practiced and gentle, and carried her to the small room they shared. When he returned, Catherine sat staring into the fire, her face lit by its warm glow, her eyes distant. He sat down beside her, not too close, but not as far as he might have a week earlier. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Catherine said, "Thomas and I, we tried for years. The house was supposed to be full of children by now." Her fingers twisted in her skirt. "I finally got pregnant. We were so happy. We painted that little room, bought a cradle. Then I lost the baby at 6 months. 3 months later, Thomas died in that field." Her voice broke on the last word. "I buried them both. One in the ground, one in my chest." Isaac's breath caught. He turned toward her, his eyes soft with understanding. "Mary, my wife, took 6 months to die," he said quietly. "Tuberculosis. Every day I watched her fade. Before she passed, she made me promise to keep living, to not let the grief swallow me whole." He shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Most days I fail." Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him. "You're not failing," she said. "You're here. For Ellie. For yourself. Anyone can see that." Their hands brushed, just for a second, on the hearth between them. The touch sent a small, unexpected jolt up her arm. She pulled back quickly, her heart pounding. "I can't lose someone again," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I won't survive it." Isaac nodded slowly, understanding more than she knew. "I'm not asking you for promises," he said. "I'm just grateful you opened the door." The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that followed. Outside, the wind had quieted, the night settling in around the homestead like a blanket. Inside, 3 souls who had once been strangers were slowly, cautiously becoming something like a family. But neither Catherine nor Isaac knew that far beyond their quiet walls, someone from Catherine's past had already decided their fragile peace was a problem to be solved. And soon, a knock very different from Isaac's would fall upon that same door, bringing with it a storm neither of them were ready for. 3 weeks after Isaac and Ellie had first stepped over Catherine's threshold, the homestead looked less like a place of mourning and more like a home trying to heal, but the quiet they had built together was about to crack. It was late afternoon, the sky a dull gray with snow clouds gathering on the horizon, when another knock sounded at the door, sharp, hard, and nothing like Isaac's hesitant plea that cold night. Catherine was in the kitchen, kneading dough, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. Isaac was bringing in firewood, boots muddy from the yard, while Ellie sat at the table drawing crooked flowers on a scrap of paper. At the sound, all 3 of them went still. Catherine felt the old dread rise up in her chest, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. She wiped her hands on her apron, glanced at Isaac, then walked slowly to the door. When she opened it, the past stood on her porch in a fine wool coat and polished boots. Marcus Albright, Thomas's older brother, taller, broader, and colder than she remembered, stared back at her with eyes that held no warmth at all. His hair was neatly combed, his mustache trimmed, his gloves spotless. Everything about him said money, order, and control. "Catherine," he said, his voice smooth and cutting. "My brother's barely cold in his grave, and I hear interesting things." His gaze slid past her shoulder, taking in Isaac's presence in the doorway behind her and the little girl peeking cautiously from the table. His lip curled slightly. "I see the rumors didn't exaggerate." Catherine's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" she asked, keeping her voice flat. Marcus stepped inside without waiting to be asked, as if the house already belonged to him. He looked around, his eyes cataloging the repaired roof, the fixed door, the warm fire, and the signs of life that had returned in the form of toys, extra dishes, and a child's shawl hanging on a peg. "I've come to make you an offer," he said. "A generous one, considering the circumstances." He turned back to her, expression hard. "Sell me the homestead. I'll pay you enough to start over somewhere else. A small place in town, perhaps. Something more suitable for a woman alone." The words felt like a slap. Catherine's jaw clenched. "This is my home," she replied. "Thomas and I built this together. I'm not selling." Marcus gave a humorless smile. "You're playing house on borrowed time, Catherine. This land is too much for you. Everyone can see that. You're taking in strays now." He glanced at Isaac with obvious contempt. A drifter and his child? His tone dripped with disgust. "Have you no shame?" Isaac took a step forward, his posture stiff, his eyes locked on Marcus. "You need to leave," he said evenly, his voice low but controlled. Marcus didn't even look at him at first. When he did, it was like he was acknowledging a bothersome animal. "You have no rights here, stranger," he said. "This is Albright land. You're nothing but a squatter." Before Isaac could respond, Catherine stepped between them, her eyes blazing. "No, Marcus," she said. "I have rights here. I'm Thomas's wife. This is my home. You don't get to walk in here like you own it." Marcus's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening. "You are making foolish choices," he said slowly. "You think this arrangement will be tolerated? A widow shacking up with some unknown man and his child? People are talking. The town respects the Albright name, not yours. I'm giving you 1 week to reconsider my offer. After that, I'll be forced to take other measures." There was an ugly promise in those words, something that made the room feel smaller and the air thinner. Catherine swallowed hard but held her ground. "Get out, Marcus," she said quietly. "You're not welcome here." Marcus studied her for a long moment, like a man appraising damaged goods. Then he tipped his hat in mock politeness. "1 week," he repeated. "Then we'll see what's left of this fantasy you're living." With that, he stepped back out into the cold and walked to his horse, his shoulders squared, his coat flapping neatly behind him in the wind. They watched him ride away, the sound of hooves fading into the distance like a storm rolling out only to gather more strength. As soon as he was gone, the tension inside the house snapped. Isaac turned to Catherine, guilt and worry written all over his face. "Maybe he's right," he said quietly. "Maybe I should go. If my staying here is giving him an excuse to come after you, I can't let that happen. I won't be the reason you lose your home." Catherine spun around, eyes flashing with sudden anger. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice sharper than it had been since he'd known her. "Don't you make that choice for me." Her voice wavered, but her words did not. "I have spent 6 months in a tomb, Isaac. 6 months walking through this house like a ghost. Then you knocked on my door, and suddenly there was laughter at my table, work being done on the land, someone sitting by the fire with me who understood what it meant to lose everything." She swallowed, her eyes growing wet. "I remembered what it felt like not to be alone. Don't you make me go back to that emptiness, because my brother-in-law wants to control everything." Isaac's chest tightened. He hadn't realized just how deeply his presence had taken root in her heart. "I just don't want you to get hurt because of us," he said, voice rough. I'm already hurt, she answered softly. There's no life without hurt. But being alone, that's a kind of death I can't go back to. Her voice broke as she added, I'm terrified of losing you, of losing her. But I'm more terrified of going back to who I was before you came. Isaac's resolve crumbled. He stepped closer, slowly, giving her a chance to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she sagged toward him, and he caught her, his arms wrapping around her in a steady, gentle embrace. For the first time since he'd arrived, she let herself cry openly against his chest, hot tears soaking his shirt. He held her like something precious, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other firm on her back. I'm not going anywhere, he murmured. Not unless you tell me to. We'll face him. Together. A small sniffle came from the doorway, and they both looked up to see Ellie standing there, eyes wide, clutching the worn doll Isaac had carved for her. Are you sad, Miss Catherine? She asked in a small voice. Catherine quickly wiped her cheeks and forced a shaky smile. Being sad means you loved something, she said gently, kneeling down to pull Ellie into her arms. And sometimes it means you still do. She hugged Ellie tightly, feeling the small heartbeat against her own. Over the little girl's shoulder, she looked up at Isaac. In that moment, without a single word spoken, the truth settled between them. They were no longer just three people sharing a roof. They were a family in the making, fragile but real. Over the next 3 days, Marcus's promise began to unfold in town like poison in a well. He went from store to saloon to church, his words carefully chosen, his face the picture of concern. I fear Catherine isn't of sound mind to manage the homestead alone, he told anyone who would listen. She's been unstable since my brother's death, burning his belongings, talking to herself, acting erratically. And now she's taken in some drifter, let him move in around my brother's things with a child in tow. It isn't right. It isn't safe. Some people nodded, ready to believe the worst. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure. That man is taking advantage of her grief, Marcus would say in a low, troubled tone. I just want what's best for her. For Thomas's memory. Rumors twisted and grew. By the end of those 3 days, half the town was convinced Isaac was some kind of opportunist, maybe even dangerous, while Catherine was a poor, unstable widow being led astray. The other half, the ones who had seen Isaac's quiet work and Ellie's growing health, weren't so sure. They defended them in small ways, but the tension in Ash Hollow was building like storm clouds ready to break. Back at the homestead, Catherine could feel the shift in the air, even if she couldn't hear every word spoken in town. Isaac grew more watchful, more guarded. Ellie asked one evening at supper, her brow furrowed, "Why don't people like us?" The question landed like a stone in the room. Catherine's throat tightened as she searched for an answer. Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, she said softly. And sometimes they listen to the wrong voices. She reached across the table and took Ellie's hand, then Isaac's. But we know the truth, and that matters. Still, as night fell on the 4th day, a sense of unease settled over the homestead. The wind had picked up, whipping loose snow across the yard. Just as Catherine was about to suggest they all turn in early, the sound came again, a hard, insistent knock at the door. It was not the timid knock of a desperate man seeking shelter. It was the confident, demanding knock of someone who believed the house, and everyone in it, belonged under his control. Catherine's heart sank. Isaac's eyes met hers from across the room, steady but wary. Ellie moved closer to Catherine, clutching her skirt. Catherine walked to the door, every step heavy, and pulled it open. There stood Marcus, coat buttoned, expression smug, and this time he was not alone. Beside him stood the town sheriff, hat low, eyes troubled, and in Marcus's gloved hand was a folded document sealed with wax. Something official, something dangerous. One look at it, and Catherine knew whatever peace they had managed to build was about to be put on trial. What he carried in his hand would threaten to destroy everything they had begun to hope for. The sheriff shifted uneasily on the porch as the wind whipped around them, his coat flapping at his sides, while Marcus stood straight and stiff, that folded document still in his gloved hand like a weapon. Catherine's fingers tightened around the edge of the door as she tried to steady her breathing. Isaac stepped up beside her, his presence solid and steady, and Ellie moved in close, clutching the side of Catherine's skirt. "Catherine," the sheriff began, his voice low and uncomfortable, "I'm real sorry to come like this, but there's been a legal claim filed." Marcus's mouth twitched in smug satisfaction. He held up the paper and flicked it open with a practiced hand. "This man," Marcus said, jabbing a finger toward Isaac, "is squatting on Albright property with no legal standing. And given your recent behavior, Catherine, I have reason to believe you're not of sound mind to manage this homestead alone." The words hit like blows. Catherine stared at him, stunned, fury and disbelief warring inside her. "That's a lie," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I've been managing this place since Thomas died. I've kept it going even when no one lifted a finger to help." Marcus ignored her protest and turned to the sheriff, presenting the paper like proof carved in stone. "This is my brother's will," he said. "It names me executor of the estate in the event that Catherine is unfit. I'm asking the law to remove this man from the property so I can take proper charge of what my brother left behind." Catherine's eyes widened. "Thomas never wrote a will like that," she snapped. "He would never hand you control over my life." Marcus gave her a pitying look that twisted into something colder. "Grief clouds memory," he said softly. "You weren't exactly stable after his passing. You burned his things, destroyed his photos, shut yourself away. People saw it. People remember." The sheriff shifted from one boot to the other, clearly torn. "Catherine," he said, "I don't like this any more than you do. But if there's a will, and if Marcus is executor—" Isaac stepped forward, jaw clenched. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not while she wants me here. Not while my daughter needs a roof over her head." Marcus's eyes flashed. "You don't get a say," he snarled. "You're nothing here. Sheriff, I'm asking you to do your duty. Remove this man from the property." Ellie's lower lip trembled as she looked between the adults. "Are they taking Papa?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The sound of her small voice cut through Catherine like a knife. Outside, a few townsfolk had already begun to gather, drawn by the sight of the sheriff's horse and the raised voices. Women in shawls, men with their hands shoved deep into their coat pockets, all watching with cautious interest. Catherine could feel their eyes on her, on Isaac, on Ellie. She felt trapped, cornered in her own doorway. The sheriff cleared his throat again. "Isaac," he said carefully, "if you leave on your own, it'll make this easier. I don't want it to come to force." Catherine could see the calculation in Isaac's eyes as he glanced at her. He was ready to go, to sacrifice his place here, to keep the peace and protect her. She could feel it in the way his shoulders dropped, in the way his hand twitched like he was about to reach for his bag. Panic flared in Catherine's chest. If he left now, Marcus would win. She would be alone again. The homestead would slip out of her hands, and the small, fragile life they'd begun to build would crumble. She thought of Ellie's laughter in the kitchen, Isaac's steady hands on the fence, the way the house had started to feel warm again. She would not lose that. A desperate, wild idea surfaced in her mind, and before fear could stop her, the words were out of her mouth. "Then marry us," she blurted. The world seemed to stop. The sheriff froze. Marcus's eyes went wide. Isaac stared at her as if he hadn't heard correctly. Even the wind seemed to hush for a heartbeat. Catherine stepped forward, her voice gaining strength as she repeated herself. "Marry us," she said to the sheriff. "Right now, marry me and Isaac. If he's my husband, Marcus can't claim he's taking advantage of me, and he can't say, I don't have someone to help me run the homestead. A husband has rights here. You know that." Isaac's heart slammed against his ribs. "Catherine," he said slowly, his voice tight, "you don't have to do this. Not like this. Not because of him. Catherine turned to face him, eyes bright with tears, but fierce with resolve. I'm not doing this just to save the land, she said, her voice low but steady. I'm doing it because I choose you. You and Ellie. You think I'd offer something like this if I didn't mean it? She swallowed hard, the vulnerability in her face plain for everyone to see. You knocked on my door, Isaac, and everything changed. I don't want to go back to the way things were before. Not ever. Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze. So will you? The sheriff looked between them, his mouth slightly open, as if he'd wandered into a scene too big for him. Marcus exploded. This is absurd, he shouted, stepping forward. Sheriff, you cannot allow this farce. She's clearly not thinking straight. This is exactly the kind of unstable behavior I'm talking about. The sheriff held up a hand to quiet him, but his eyes stayed locked on Isaac and Catherine. The small crowd outside pressed closer, their curiosity now fully engaged. A whisper moved through them like wind through dry grass. Is she really asking him to marry her? Out here? On the porch? Can he even do that? Isaac looked down at Catherine, at the woman who had once greeted him with a rifle and now stood before him with her heart in her hands. He thought of Mary, of the promise he had made to keep living. He thought of the way Ellie slept peacefully for the first time in months, the way Catherine smiled now, sometimes when she thought no one was looking. He thought of the home they were slowly building together, plank by plank, day by day. His eyes burned with sudden, overwhelming emotion. He reached out and took her hands in his, rough fingers closing around her smaller ones. Yes, he said, his voice breaking. Catherine, yes. I'll marry you. Tears spilled over onto her cheeks, and a shaky breath escaped her lips. Marcus made a sound of pure frustration and turned on the sheriff. You can't do this, he snapped. You can't just marry them on the porch in the middle of a dispute. This is a legal trick, nothing more. The sheriff straightened up, his jaw setting in quiet resolve. Marcus, you came to me with a legal mess, he said. But the law is the law. A husband has standing. If she wants to marry him, and he wants to marry her, and there's no legal reason why they can't, I'm not the one who's going to stop it. From the edge of the crowd, someone called, "Pastor's here." Heads turned as the town pastor stepped forward, his face caught somewhere between disapproval and a reluctant sense of duty. He had clearly been watching from the road, waiting to see how things played out. Now, with all eyes on him, he cleared his throat. This is highly irregular, he said slowly, but the vows of marriage are not a joke. If you both are serious, I will not treat them as one. Catherine and Isaac exchanged a look, and in that look was everything. Fear, hope, grief, and something fragile but strong beginning to take root. We're serious, Catherine said. More serious than I've been about anything in a long time. The sheriff nodded once and stepped aside, giving the pastor space on the porch. A few neighbors moved closer, some out of nosy curiosity, others with genuine concern. Ellie slipped her hand into Catherine's, her eyes wide but shining. Does this mean he'll always stay with us? She whispered. Catherine squeezed her hand gently. That's what it means, she said softly. The pastor opened his Bible, the pages rustling in the cold air. Marcus stood rigid at the edge of the porch, jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek, fury simmering just below the surface. Catherine could feel her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone must hear it. As the first words of the ceremony left the pastor's lips, she realized there was no turning back now. Not from the man beside her, not from the life they were about to step into, and not from the battle that would surely follow once the final "I do" was spoken. The pastor's hands trembled slightly as he held his Bible, the wind tugging at the pages while the gathered townsfolk shifted on their feet, breath turning to mist in the cold air. Catherine stood on the porch in her plain day dress, the same one she'd worn to town so many times alone, but felt different now with Isaac beside her, his work shirt still smelling faintly of sawdust and smoke. Ellie clung to Catherine's hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around it, as if she sensed the importance of the moment, even if she didn't fully understand it. The sheriff stood to one side, hat in hand, acting as both witness and guard, while Marcus hovered near the edge of the porch, jaw clenched, eyes burning with anger and disbelief. The pastor cleared his throat. "We are gathered here," he began, voice unsteady at first, "under the eyes of God and the witness of this community, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words, so familiar in church on quiet Sundays, sounded strange and powerful against the open sky and the tension in the air. Catherine's heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. She glanced at Isaac, and he looked back at her with eyes that were full of something she hadn't seen in a long time. Gentleness, strength, and a kind of awe, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening either. The pastor turned to Isaac. "Do you, Isaac Granger, take this woman, Catherine Albright, to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" For a moment Isaac could not find his voice. Memories flashed through his mind. Mary's frail hand in his as she lay dying, the long, lonely months of wandering, the desperate knock on a stranger's door, Catherine's tearful, fierce proposal just moments ago. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, and tears shone in his eyes. "I do," he said, the words rough but firm. A tear slid down his cheek, and he did not bother to wipe it away. The pastor nodded and turned to Catherine. "Do you, Catherine Albright, take this man, Isaac Granger, to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Catherine had been bracing herself, afraid her voice would shake, afraid she would falter under the weight of all that she had lost and all that she was daring to hope for again. But when she opened her mouth, her words came out clear and strong, surprising even her. "I do," she said, each syllable steady, as if she were laying a stone in a new foundation. The pastor offered a small, soft smile, as if the courage in her voice had steadied him too. "By the power vested in me," he said, lifting his hand slightly, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." There was a beat of silence, a moment where time seemed to hold its breath, and then he added with quiet finality, "Isaac, you may kiss your bride." Isaac looked at Catherine, seeking permission in her eyes. For a moment, they simply stood there, two people scarred by loss and hardship, daring to step towards something new. Then Catherine gave a small nod. He leaned in slowly, his hand lifting to gently cradle her cheek, and their lips met in a tender, careful kiss. No grand display, just a simple, honest promise sealed in front of God and the town. When they parted, Catherine realized they were both crying. The crowd murmured, some with approval, some with disapproval. Mrs. Abernathy sniffed loudly, clearly offended, while a few others dabbed at their eyes with the corners of their scarves. Marcus, however, had seen enough. He spun on his heel, fury etched into every line of his face, and stalked off the porch, boots crunching hard in the snow. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath as he passed the sheriff, but the lawn now had less room to bend his way. As he disappeared down the path toward his horse, the air around the homestead seemed to loosen, as if a tight band had finally been cut. For a moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Jennings, an older widow with kind eyes and a sharp memory, stepped forward from the crowd. "I'll testify," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Thomas never told me a thing about a will like that. I knew that boy since he was knee-high. He'd never put his brother over his own wife." The statement hung there, tilting the mood. The blacksmith, a broad man with soot still on his hands, nodded. "Isaac's done good work for folks already," he added. "Fixed my wagon wheel, refused payment. Don't look like a man taking advantage to me." The schoolteacher, Miss Carter, thin and serious, stepped up next. "That little girl," she said, nodding toward Ellie, "has been in town twice now. She says please and thank you, and she smiles when she talks about them. Children don't lie about where they feel safe." One by one, a few more people spoke up. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to shift the balance. The sheriff put his hat back on and tipped it toward Catherine and Isaac. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Granger," he said, then paused as Catherine lifted her chin just a little. "Albright Granger," she corrected gently. "I'm still Thomas's widow, and I'm Isaac's wife now. Both are true." The sheriff nodded with respect. "Mrs. Albright Granger," he said, "we'll sort out the papers. He won't be able to push you around so easy now." Slowly, as the initial shock wore off, the tone of the gathering softened. A couple of neighbors stepped up to shake Isaac's hand. One woman pressed a wrapped loaf of bread into Catherine's arms. Another man muttered something about bringing by some extra seed come planting time. It wasn't a grand celebration, but it was more support than she had felt from this town in months. For the first time since Thomas's death, Catherine did not feel like a ghost standing on her own porch. She felt seen, not just as a grieving widow or a subject of gossip, but as a woman who had chosen a future in front of everyone. By the time the sun began to sink, the crowd had drifted away. The pastor had closed his Bible and offered a final blessing, and the sheriff had promised to return with some formal paperwork to log the marriage. The yard grew quiet again, just the three of them left standing in the softening light. Ellie looked up at them, eyes shining. "Does this mean you're my mama now?" she asked Catherine, almost shyly. The question pierced straight through Catherine's heart. She knelt down so they were eye to eye. "It means," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's face, "that if you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your mama." Ellie's answer was quick and certain. She threw her arms around Catherine's neck. "I like that very much," she whispered. Inside, the house felt different somehow, even though nothing physical had changed. It was the same worn floorboards, the same patchwork quilts, the same crack in a window pane, but now there was a new layer over everything. A sense of belonging, of something claimed and named out loud. After supper, they got Ellie ready for bed together, tucking her under the blankets as she clutched her wooden doll. "Good night, Mama," she murmured sleepily, testing the new word on her tongue. Catherine's throat tightened as she leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered. When Ellie finally drifted off, leaving the house quiet and still, Catherine and Isaac found themselves alone in the main room, the fire throwing warm light over the walls. Suddenly, all the noise and chaos of the day fell away, and they were just two people who had gotten married on a porch in front of half the town. An awkward, nervous energy settled over them both. Catherine smoothed her hands over her skirt, then let out a small, breathy laugh. "I didn't exactly plan that proposal," she admitted, glancing at him from under her lashes. Isaac chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't plan to say yes so fast," he replied. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight and wonder of the day hanging between them. "Any regrets?" she asked softly, the question honest, not fishing, but needing to know. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Not one," he said. "You." Catherine swallowed, feeling that old familiar fear stirring, but now it mixed with something softer. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But no regrets." Isaac nodded slowly. "We can take this slow," he said gently. "We both lost a lot. We don't have to rush anything we're not ready for. We can just be here, together." His words soothed something raw inside her. She took a small step toward him, then another, until she was close enough to feel his warmth. He didn't reach for her, didn't pull her in, just waited. Catherine lifted a hand and placed it lightly on his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat under her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned up and kissed him. This kiss was different from the one on the porch. There was no crowd, no legal threat hovering over them, no pastor watching. It was slow and tentative and real, born not out of desperation, but out of choice. When they finally parted, they rested their foreheads together, breathing the same quiet air. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the house, for the first time in a long time, felt like a place where something new could grow. But as they held each other in that fragile, hopeful silence, neither Catherine nor Isaac knew that Marcus, humiliated and burning with spite, was already planning his next move. And what he would attempt next would test their new bond and their little family in ways they could never have imagined. 2 weeks after the porch wedding, just when the house was starting to settle into a new, gentle rhythm, Marcus returned, not with a sheriff this time, but with a lawyer from the county seat and a look of cold confidence that made Catherine's stomach twist. The lawyer was a thin man in a dark coat with wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a leather satchel and a stack of papers that looked heavy with trouble. They called for a formal hearing at the town hall, saying it was only right that the matter of the homestead, the will, and Catherine's sudden marriage be settled properly. On the day of the hearing, the sky hung low and gray, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. Catherine dressed in her best dress, which still wasn't much, and Isaac helped Ellie into her little wool coat. The girl clung to Catherine's hand as they walked into town together, the entire journey feeling like they were walking into a courtroom instead of a simple wooden hall used for church meetings and town gatherings. Inside, half the town seemed to be there already, sitting on benches and along the walls, their faces curious, some sympathetic, others hard to read. Marcus sat near the front with his lawyer, his back straight, his expression smug. At the front table sat a traveling judge from the county seat, a stern man with silver hair and sharp eyes who had come in just for this. The sheriff stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Once everyone settled, the judge called the room to order and asked Marcus's lawyer to present his case. The lawyer stood and began in a smooth, rehearsed voice, explaining that Marcus, as the executor of Thomas Albright's will, believed Catherine to be unfit to manage the homestead and claimed her new marriage had been done under duress purely to avoid lawful authority. He held up the supposed will, reading the parts that named Marcus as executor if Catherine's grief and instability rendered her incapable. Each word felt like another stone being stacked against her. When it was their turn to speak, Catherine's knees shook, but Isaac's hand on her back steadied her. She rose and faced the judge. "My husband never wrote a will like that," she said simply. "Thomas told me everything. We shared everything. He would never give Marcus that kind of power over me." The judge studied her for a long moment, then asked if anyone in the town had evidence one way or another. For a quiet second, no one moved. Then, slowly, Mrs. Jennings stood up from the back, leaning on her cane. "Your Honor," she called in a clear, surprisingly strong voice. "I knew Thomas from the time he was a boy. He confided in me after his father died. If he'd written a will, I would have known. He told me more than once he'd never trust Marcus with something as important as this land or his wife." A low murmur ran through the room. Before the judge could respond, another figure rose, a younger farmer who had done work with Thomas. "I was there the day Thomas bought new ledgers for the homestead," he said. He joked that if he ever did write a will, he'd hand everything to his wife because she had more sense than both Albright brothers put together. A few people chuckled softly at that, easing the tension just a bit. Then, to everyone's surprise, the door opened and in walked a man with a worn satchel and ink-stained fingers. Mr. Colton, the lawyer from the previous year who had passed through Ash Hollow and helped with land disputes. "I heard there was talk of a will," he said. "And since my name was mentioned in town, I came to clear something up." Marcus stiffened. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he snapped, but the judge motioned for silence. Mr. Colton opened his satchel and pulled out a small, folded document. "Last year, Thomas asked me to look over some property papers," he said, "but he never drafted a will with me. In fact, he said he didn't want anything binding until he and his wife had children. He signed nothing of the sort as this," he added, nodding toward the document Marcus's lawyer held. The judge's eyes narrowed. He asked to see Marcus's paper, then compared the signatures, his gaze focused and sharp. After a long, tense pause, he looked up. "This signature isn't consistent," he said. "The pen stroke, the pressure, this is either altered or forged." A gasp went through the room. The judge turned his hard stare on Marcus. "Do you have any explanation for this discrepancy?" he asked. Marcus's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His lawyer shifted uneasily, suddenly less confident. Seeing the tide turn, more townsfolk found their courage. The blacksmith stood up and testified that Isaac had been working steadily, repairing wagons and tools for fair or no pay, and that he'd never once seen him take advantage of anyone. Miss Carter, the schoolteacher, spoke about Ellie, how the child had come into town thin and hollow-eyed and now looked stronger, happier, and safe, always talking about her Miss Catherine and Papa Isaac. Their words painted a picture the judge could not ignore. After hearing everyone who wished to speak, the judge called the room to order once more. "It is my ruling," he said finally, his voice carrying through the hall, "that this supposal presented by Marcus Albright is invalid due to strong evidence of forgery and lack of legal witness. Catherine Albright Granger is the rightful owner of the homestead, and her marriage to Isaac Granger is recognized as lawful and voluntary." He paused, then added, "Furthermore, if any attempt is made to challenge her rights through false documents again, charges of fraud will be considered." Marcus's face turned a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then shut it again when he saw the sheriff's steady gaze and the crowd, now clearly turning against him. With a bitter glare at Catherine and Isaac, he grabbed his coat and stormed out of the hall, his boots pounding the floor, the door slamming behind him. It was the sound of a chapter closing. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to its new normal. Marcus left town quietly not long after, unable to show his face without whispers following him. The tension in Ash Hollow eased, replaced with a cautious, growing respect for the small family at the Albright Granger homestead. Isaac began taking on more regular carpentry jobs, building fences, mending roofs, and even crafting simple furniture for neighbors. Catherine, with gentle nudging from Mrs. Jennings and others, started bringing baked goods and fresh bread to town to sell. People who once only whispered about her now greeted her by name. Ellie ran between them, always talking, always smiling, as if the weight that had once pressed on her tiny shoulders had finally lifted. One evening, a month after the hearing, Catherine sat with Isaac by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, a secret resting on her tongue. She had been waiting for the right moment, her heart fluttering with a mix of joy and fear. At last she turned to him, her eyes shining. "Isaac," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." His brow furrowed with concern until he saw the small, hopeful smile tugging at her lips. "What is it?" he asked. She reached for his hand and placed it gently over her stomach. "I'm late," she said, her voice trembling. "And I don't think it's just the winter throwing me off. I think we're going to have a baby." For a moment, Isaac just stared at her, the words echoing in his mind. Then his eyes filled with tears, and a laugh choked its way out of his chest, full and disbelieving and joyful all at once. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never meant to let go. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Catherine, that's a miracle." Ellie, who had been half dozing by the fire, perked up. "A baby," she repeated, eyes wide. "Like a real baby?" "Our baby." Catherine nodded, wiping at her eyes and laughing. "Yes, sweetheart, you're going to be a big sister." Ellie squealed and threw herself at them, wrapping her small arms around both their shoulders in a clumsy hug. "I'll help," she declared. "I'll be the best big sister in the whole world." As winter gave way to spring in 1888, the land around the homestead transformed. Snow melted into soft, dark soil. Tiny green shoots pushed up in the garden Catherine carefully tended, the first hopeful signs of the harvest to come. Isaac built a new fence around the pasture and brought home a milk cow and a few more chickens, their clucks and lowing adding fresh sounds to the once quiet farm. The house, once dim and hollow, now buzzed with life. The smell of bread baking, the scrape of chairs, the sound of Ellie practicing her reading, the gentle creak of the rocking chair Catherine used when she grew tired late in the day. One clear afternoon, months after the hearing, the three of them spread a blanket on a grassy hill overlooking their land. Catherine was visibly pregnant now, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly. Isaac lay beside her, propped on one elbow, watching Ellie chase a butterfly in crooked circles, her laughter filling the air. They shared roasted chicken, fresh bread, and early greens from the garden. The sky above was a bright, endless blue, and wildflowers dotted the hillside in small bursts of color. "Do you ever think about that night?" Catherine asked softly, her eyes on the barn in the distance. The barn Isaac had once been desperate just to sleep in. Isaac followed her gaze. "Every day," he said quietly. "I think about what would have happened if you'd said no. If you turned us away." She shivered, but not from the cold. "I almost did," she admitted. "I was so scared of letting anyone in. I thought if I stayed alone, nothing else could be taken from me." She turned to look at him, her eyes warm. "But then I saw Ellie, and then I saw you, and something in me woke up." Isaac smiled, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from her face. "If you'd said no," he said, "Ellie and I might not have made it through that winter. But you didn't. You opened the door." She let out a breath, her gaze softening as she watched Ellie tumble onto the grass and pop back up again. "Best risk I ever took," she murmured. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Best thing that ever happened to us," he replied. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they gathered their things and walked slowly back toward the house, hand in hand, Ellie skipping ahead. The barn doors stood open, filled with hay, tools, and the quiet evidence of a life rebuilt. Once, it had been the place Isaac was willing to settle for just to survive one more night. Now, it was part of a home that belonged to all of them. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's wagon rolled past on the road, and the driver lifted a hand in easy greeting. Catherine waved back without hesitation. She no longer felt like a shadow on the edge of town. She was a wife, a mother, a neighbor, and a woman who had chosen to live again. If you'd been standing there watching, you might have heard a quiet voice, a storyteller's voice say, it started with a knock on a door and 5 desperate words. "Can we sleep in the barn?" Catherine had every reason to say no. She had lost a husband, a child, and nearly herself. Fear told her to stay locked away. Pain told her to trust no one. But that night, she looked past the walls she'd built and saw what really mattered. A father's love for his little girl, a child's need for warmth, and her own hidden longing for life again. One answer changed everything. Not just for Catherine and Isaac and Ellie, but for a town that watched a broken widow choose mercy over fear and saw how that choice rippled outward, healing old wounds, exposing lies, and reminding them that sometimes grace looks as simple as opening your door in the middle of a storm. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many lives could change if more of us chose to say yes when it would be easier to turn away. And if you'd like to hear more stories about courage, second chances, and the quiet power of kindness, you're welcome to stay, listen, and come back for the next one. Because sometimes the people who knock on our door are the very people we've been waiting for all along.